All right? As a mere right, it was not exclusive in the Indians. Citizens might share it, but the Indians were secured in its enjoyment by a special provision of means for its exercise. They were given the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed places, and the right of erecting temporary buildings, etc. The contingency of the future ownership of the lands, therefore, was foreseen and provided for. In other words, the Indians were given a right in the land, the right of crossing it to the river, the right to occupy it to the extent and for the purpose mentioned. No other conclusion would give effect to the treaty, etc., etc. And the right was intended to be continuing against the United States. And by the way, okay, as soon as Oregon became a state, then the state government of Oregon became successor, right? So within 5 years of the signing of the Stevens Treaty, right? The Stevens Treaties were signed in 1854 and 1855. Oregon becomes a state in 1859. At that point, it becomes successor to the obligations of the federal government. Right? And same thing with Washington. When Washington becomes a state in 1889, it succeeds to the obligations that and it succeeds to this servitude, right? That the federal government had. All right? All right, well, so it's instructive, and I hope that you found that interesting and useful to you in your understanding of Northwest environmental history, environmental history, and history of Northwest environmentalism. The tribes really have a great deal of power, although probably not anywhere near as much as arguably they should have. And it never ceases to amaze me. I think next week is our designated day. One of the days next week we're supposed to talk about Salivo Falls, but it never ceases to amaze me that we live in a society, in a country which could somehow reconcile the Stevens Treaties and its obligations, right? Our mainstream society's obligations under the Stevens Treaties. It just never ceases to amaze me that those obligations could somehow be reconciled with the construction of the Dalles Dam and Bonneville Dam. Yeah, it's kind of an insensitivity. I mentioned those two engineering students upstairs that I didn't have to say anything, but they were talking about Bonneville Dam, and so I volunteered that I believe that Bonneville Dam, maybe we should think about removing it. And their response was derisive. They acted as though it was a preposterous idea, and nobody would go with it. And they were probably right. Nobody would go with it. Very few people would agree with that. Culturally, and if we allow culture, right? But there are certain issues that in a republic, in a constitutionally limited republic such as the United States of America, there are certain issues we're not supposed to turn over to culture, to popular opinion, right? So it seems like one issue would be our obligations under treaties. Our treaty obligation, our country's treaty obligations would be one issue that we can't just turn over to culture, right? And somehow the idea that you can protect their rights to harvest salmon and fish, not just salmon, but they harvested lamprey also, and sturgeon, and maybe some other. Those are the three main fish that they harvested. The sturgeon were huge, right? They got to be really big. We have these really, really large white sturgeon in the Columbia River, 1,200 pounds, like 10, 12 feet long. And then the lamprey are very interesting little fish too. But anyway, the idea that their rights the rights that they had protected in their treaties could be preserved, right? They could still exercise those rights, even though the sites, right? SITES, the sites where they exercised those rights are now 50 feet underwater. You know, so now they use gill nets, right? Nowadays, they're the only commercial fishery on the Columbia River now. A few years ago, they phased out the non-Indian commercial fishery on the lower Columbia, right? But the only commercial fishery left is, you know, these Native Americans, the treaty fishery, right? But they have to use gill nets, right? They can't harvest fish because the water, right? The conditions are completely different. But so, you know, you could say, okay, that makes sense, right? They're still fishing there. But imagine, you know, knowing that your family, your ancestors own, you know, they own. I mean, it's a strange term perhaps, you know, for them, but those fishing sites were passed on from, you know, from generation to generation, from father to son or uncle to nephew, right? And now they still know where their fishing sites are, right? But before they could identify them from landmarks, right? From that rock over here, you know, this is where our family always fished. This is where we set up our platforms, right? Now those landmarks are all underwater. They don't have any of those landmarks left, you know. So, but they still have rights to cast their nets, right? In those roughly where. Anyway, it's just odd to think that their rights were protected, even though the sites themselves were inundated. You know, were totally submerged. And I'm not sure if that's really possible, but that seems to be, you know, if we need an argument, if we need some kind of philosophical explanation for how all of that makes sense, how are you going to honor their treating rights and also build these giant dams that put all their fishing sites underwater, you know, then I guess, you know, somehow they did that. But basically, the federal government came to the tribes. And the tribes were the only main group. There were also non-Indian commercial fishers who opposed construction of the Dalles Dam and construction of Bonneville Dam, right? There were some non-Indian commercial, but there were no environmentalists at any of the hearings when the federal government laid down what they wanted to do, right? But they approached the tribal representatives and they said, we're going to do this, and we want to compensate you for the loss of your sites, right? But we're not destroying your rights. You still have your rights, but we want to compensate you, and so here's a bunch of money. But if you refuse the money, or if you refuse this agreement, then we're going to do it anyway, right? That's basically what was said to the tribal representatives. Take it or leave it, right? And so many of them, because their people were so poor, and still are very poor, many of them thought they had they were going to take the money, right? Because it was, you know, some money, not very much, relative to the value of what they were giving up. You know, it was nothing, really, just a pittance, you know, just nothing, really, compared to how much they lost. But anyway, and so that's what happened, and, you know, and then they gave up Celilo Falls, and they gave up all their sites, you know, that were flooded by Bonneville. You know, and they were compensated. And then the federal government established these in lieu sites too. That's another ongoing, you know, that's just some of the most beleaguered and troubled and dysfunctional, I don't know. But, you know, there are those river Indians that live, they've always lived, they never left the river, they're not affiliated with any tribes, and they had these, you know, they lived year-round there. At places that were flooded by you know, Bonneville Dam and the Dalles Dam. So they got all these in lieu sites, but the in lieu sites are just terrible, and the conditions are just terrible, and it's really shameful. It seems as though now our Representative Earl Blumenauer and Merkley, Senator Merkley, are trying to do something about it. So some of you might have been paying attention. The Oregonian did a series of I think a major article on those in lieu sites, but anyway, in lieu means replacement, right? Instead of, right? And that's just what the government and what the Indians themselves have always called these places, these in lieu sites. There are 31 in lieu sites on the north and the south side of the Columbia River. And they're all, you know, they're places where Native Americans go. Some of them have year-round facilities where, you know, people can live, and some of them are only seasonal. Some of them have just like maybe an electric outlet and that's it, you know, and some of them actually have buildings. Anyway, but there are 31 on you know, total, and they're on both sides, in the north and the south, and they're places where that are supposed to compensate for the loss of the sites, you know, that were flooded, and yet it's kind of sad, you know, that the one that, you know, I encourage my students to take a philosophy field trip And the one site you can go visit is over by the Dalles. If you go to the Dalles Dam, right, which is right in the town of the Dalles, and you're on I-84, just look down right before you get to the dam, and you'll see this cluster of RVs and this little encampment, and that's one of the Indian sites where people who were flooded out of Bonneville, by Bonneville Dam, that's where they went. And they've been struggling there for this whole time, to try to maintain their traditional way of life. Their moderate living standard is all they want. They want a moderate living standard from the salmon that they've always relied on. And yet there they are in this little cluster of RVs, in these ramshackle. Most of them don't have any electricity. They're living there all year round. And if you look out, right, the Dalles Dam is just huge, right? And it has this arm that extends down the middle of the river like this and then goes back out, right? And so they're surrounded literally on two sides by the dam, right? Like this and like this. And then on this side there's the freeway and the railroad. And it's just, they're surrounded by industry and technology. And yet there they are, trying to do what their ancestors did for at least 13,000 years. People have been somewhere there, harvesting salmon. And anyway, something obviously, a big part of what needs to change in our relationship with the Columbia River is probably we need to start thinking more about their traditional management practices, because they were able to, they had a sustainable relationship with the salmon resource. And perhaps under the Stevens Treaties that we have some obligation to give them more power. I keep coming to the end of that. And we still haven't. All right, so what does Thomas Birch have to say? Thomas Birch's reading of environmental ethics, I think, is more consistent. If you come at environmental ethics more from a Native American point of view, perhaps you'd end up with something more like what Thomas Birch has to offer us. All right? And he reads, really he's giving us a choice. You know what I think the choice he's giving us? He's giving us a choice between going corporate and going indigenous. And he's suggesting that we'd be better off going indigenous. All right? And he's suggesting that what ownership, we're heading down this road toward consolidation and ownership of the imperium in all of nature, right? And including ourselves. And anyway, I'm going a little too fast. Let's see. What does he say here? Okay. So we've been going down this journey for the last month or so, trying to understand why we might have moral obligations to ecological wholes. Okay. And in asking that question, we have tended to think of our project as one involving the identification of some entities in nature that have moral status. Okay. And we've tended to assume that perhaps mainstream society is a little behind the curve, right? They haven't identified as many, there are more entities than mainstream society accepts, right? And so we need to change mainstream society and start, we need to somehow influence mainstream society to start accepting that, for example, an old-growth forest has moral standing, okay? That's right, that's the story that many environmentalists tell. That, that's our task as environmentalists and as environmental ethicists. Our task is to explain to the non-believer, the non-environmentalist, why we have obligations to protect old-growth forests and salmon runs and free-flowing rivers and orca populations and the earth as a whole, right? And worry about global climate change and anthropogenic climate destabilization, right? And yet, Birch's point is that this way of framing our task, this way of framing the work of environmental ethics, tends to play into the project of the project of empire that. So let's see what he says on page 315. He says, when we take the question of moral considerability all the way down to the origins of ethical experience and reflection, to what I call deontic experience. All right? We will find that the most abiding presuppositions of the question, all right, the question about moral consideration, as it has usually been understood, as this question has usually been understood, must be abandoned. These presuppositions are that we can and ought to find, formulate, establish, and institute in our practice. This is what the environmentalist is saying we must do, right, as a society. We can and ought to find, formulate, establish, and institute in our practices, right, by changing our legal system, for example, or changing our economy, a criterion for membership in the class of beings that are moral consideranda. Right? Moral consideranda means that class, you know, those entities which are morally considerable. These are the beings that have moral standing, the beings that must be given moral consideration and must not be simply used or used up, must not be just property, right? Can't be thought of as property, or somehow treated as we might simply please, or treated in a manner uninformed by respect, or treated in a manner that is in no way cognizant of the possibility that we might have direct obligations to them. Direct, right? Direct obligations. In short, it has been presupposed that when it comes to moral considerability, there are and ought to be insiders and outsiders, right? The outsiders are the others, right? That's why I think we ought to have an Others Day. Insiders and outsiders, citizens and non-citizens, right? That's how, you know, the big landowner responds to Leopold. To hell with that, they're non-citizens, right? What do you mean I can't push all, you know, I can't log my stream, my steep banks? What do you mean, man? This is my land. I'm gonna cut down these trees, and I'm gonna take it to market, and I'm gonna get rich, right? And this is America, and I can do what I want, right? Well, who are you to tell me? Why should the environmentalist tell me that that's not what I should do, right? They're not in the class of citizens, right? The forest and the stream are not citizens, they're outsiders, they're others, right? And I can do with them as I please, okay? We can and ought to identify the marks or marks of membership, right? And the Leopoldian says, now wait a minute now. That stream and that forest have integrity and stability. Those are marks of membership in the moral community, right? That's what the Leopoldian says to the big landowner who wants to cut the trees on his hillside, right? And the Leopoldian says we ought to identify those entities with moral status in a rational and non-arbitrary way, right? And we ought to go so far as to institute practices, right, by changing our laws that enforce the marks of membership, right? Enforce the idea, which is just an idea, but if we put it in a law, then it enforces the idea that the hillside, the forest, the stream, all are members of our community and with some degree of rights. Okay? Right? And that sums up the environmentalist project, right? That's how we went from Leopold, you know, the incident with the wolf, changing his metaphysics, etc., etc., etc. 50 years later, writing, or 40 years later, writing, Thinking Like a Mountain. And then 20 years later, along comes Christopher Stone, and he's inspired by Leopold, and he writes, Should Trees Have Standing? And then the Supreme Court Justice, William O. Douglas, reads it. He's also inspired by Leopold, and he's inspired by Stone. And they say we need to change our practices. We need to change our legal system to accommodate the idea that ecological wholes have moral status, right? So we've been trying to explain in what sense they might have moral status. And now along comes Thomas Birch, and he tells us that this entire project, there's something flawed, something deeply flawed about this entire project, okay? About this demand for a criterion or a set of criteria for moral status. Why is that a problem? It leads us down the wrong track because, in the most fundamental sense of all, everything has moral status. Okay? Why? Because having moral status is a hallmark of human experience. That's what human animals do. Part of what we understand is our the moral dimensions of our obligations. Okay? That's what humans do. That's a generic feature. A pragmatist might say that's a generic deontic experience. The experience of that which we must do is a generic feature of all experience. Okay? There's no getting around it. And exercise, thinking about that which we must do leads us to understand moral obligations, right? And remember, Birch's main point, his main overall point is that that which we have moral obligations to always ends up exceeding, going beyond our definition of moral considerability. Okay? So let's get rid of moral considerability, right? Get rid of it, because that which we deontically experience is always deeper, right, than that which we can say, like Rolston or Regan, right, meets the criteria, right? We can never get a firm grip on the necessary and sufficient criteria for moral considerability. Okay? That's Birch's central point. Okay, so so the demand for a criterion, he uses Tom Regan to illustrate this demand for a criterion of moral considerability. Birch says, in itself, the notion of inherent value, which is the term that both Regan and Collicutt use, the notion of inherent value seems to be, right, this is the notion that they use to substantiate their description, right, of that which has moral status. Okay? It has inherent value. That's what I say. Why does it have moral status? Why do we have moral obligations to it? Why should we change the law in this fundamental way to make it, to protect, this? Well, it's because they have inherent value. The ecological whole, the pristine alpine valley, they have moral value. The climate system, they have moral status, right? They have inherent value, right? The climate system has inherent value, and that's why it has moral status. Okay? But Birch says the notion of inherent value seems to be an empty place marker demanded by the logic of our traditional kind of theorizing about moral considerability. The demand for a criterion. Okay? What Regan and others have shown us is that what can be found and established is not a criterion or criteria for moral considerability, but simply various reasons for practicing moral consideration in various ways, in ethically responsive and responsible relationships with various sorts of other entities. That is, Regan seems to be right in holding that one way to practice our moral consideration for certain sorts of animals is to institute a recognition that they have certain sorts of rights. Rodman, this Australian environmental ethicist named John Rodman, who we didn't read, Rodman has shown us that, at least insofar as we can see that some entity has a telos, there's that word again, huh? I keep telling you, man, so much work gets done by moral philosophers on this concept of telos. That which has a telos has an interiority, has a moral status, right? So anyway, that's Rod, right? This is should be familiar to you, right? Instead of reading John Rodman, we read Holmes Rolston, and who really makes this argument more artfully and eloquently. But this other guy, John Rodman, has shown us that, at least insofar as we can see that some entity has a telos, we must show our consideration by worrying about our possible interference with that entity's realization of its telos. And then Paul Taylor, who we didn't read, but I lectured about in conjunction with Schweitzer, his mentor. Taylor has done much the same in the case of entities that can be said to have a good of their own, right? Thus, instead of one criterion of moral considerability, there turn out to be various rules for the practicing of various sorts of consideration in relation to various kinds of things. And so, if our concern is the suffering of a chimpanzee in a laboratory experiment, if our concern is the flopping and suffering of a fish on the end of a hook, if our concern is the suffering of the wounded deer who's been shot by the not quite so skilled hunter, then we might well want to adopt an individualistic more than anthropocentric perspective, right? I think that's one thing that what Thomas Birch is saying. And he's rejecting monism. He's rejecting moral monism. Okay? Thomas Birch is urging us toward moral pluralism. All right? And he's saying that what all these other authors that he cites have instructed us on is important, because they've shown us that we can have moral obligations to a range of different entities other than just individual human beings. And that's a very important point to consider, right? So that's good that they've done that work. Regan has done that work with respect to non-human animals, right? With his subject of a life criterion, right? And then Rolston has done that work with respect to ecological wholes, right? You know, using his version of the categorical imperative, you know. And yet, when any one of these thinkers asserts that he or she has identified the one reason to treat entities with respect, then they become a monist, and they have they've abandoned the pluralism that nature invites us to. Okay, I think that's part of Thomas Birch's thesis, and this is also a hallmark of environmental pragmatism and a hallmark of deep ecology. Nature itself is prolific and pluralistic, and just as nature doesn't generate, I don't know, I'm kind of personalizing nature or something like that, but in the natural world, we never just find one kind of thing. We find many kinds of everything. It's amazing how much abundance and diversity there is in the natural world. And so Thomas Birch says, why should our minds be any different than that, right? And just as there are many different kinds of life in the universe, there are many different apprehensions of the value of that life. And we don't want to shut down any of them, okay? So, as an environmental pragmatist, we might reinterpret Birch's thesis as follows. Humans have Birch says we have an obligation to preserve sources of deontic experience. Okay? That's Birch's main thesis, right? And that's why we should set aside wilderness, and that's why, keep setting aside as much as possible, restore as much as possible, protect as many species as possible, okay? So practically, policy-wise, he's totally on board with Rolston and Collicutt and all these other people that he's criticizing, right? For buying into this all these Cartesian dualisms and the overall project of the Imperium, right? But he says that we need to be doing those things. We need to be protecting wilderness and protecting species, because doing so preserves deontic experience for all of us. And right? The deontic experience of, for example, a guy like Rolston, who was really educated about evolutionary history and ecology, but I don't want to say it's just a human experience, right? I want to say too that up here we might find experiences that are totally non-human, like the experience of a species adapting evolutionarily over time, right? That's a kind of experience. And so the environmental manager is entrusted, from Thomas Birch's perspective and from an environmental pragmatist perspective, the land manager, the wildlife manager, okay, the Smokey Bear person working for the government agency is obligated to protect as many as possible. These all represent experiences of value in natural resources, okay? All of these points on our circle represent different kinds of experiences, and up here are the most exotic experiences of all, right? The experience of a species adapting itself evolutionarily over a long period of time. That is an experience of value that's not centered in a human being, right, or even in an animal, even furry, or even in a fish or anything, right? It's centered in a species, which is a bit perhaps odd way of speaking, and I readily acknowledge that, you know. And anyway. So where are we? So Birch, so he says, instead of one criterion of moral considerability, there turn out to be various kinds. He says various rules for the practicing of various sorts of consideration. But in short, he says, instead of one criterion of moral considerability, there are many different kinds. And why foreclose, right? He accuses, not expressly, doesn't call out anybody really, except maybe Regan. He doesn't call out Rolston, certainly, but I think underlying his message would include, saying to Rolston that you're trying to artificially delimit our experience of value. And while all of your wonderful work has done a lot to illustrate different kinds of experiences of value, you can't claim to have captured, right? And so, anyway, perhaps the objective for the environmental pragmatist, resource manager, and the objective for the resource manager is trying to take Thomas Birch seriously, okay? How does all this translate? Everything's supposed to be morally considerable? Well, this is what I would suggest, is that the overall guideline of resource management is to make as many of the experiences of value that are referred to on this chart available to as many people as possible, okay? To as many people and or non-people, right? Entities. So, and right now, you could criticize, right? And this would be perhaps a point of criticism, of cultural criticism, right? Which many people perhaps are interested in, right? I know I am. There's something deeply discouraging and dispiriting about contemporary U.S. society, and I'm interested in criticizing our culture because I think our culture is deeply, deeply dysfunctional and defective and broken. And so where does our cultural criticism come from? Well, from an environmental pragmatist point of view, the problem with our culture is we keep emphasizing these anthropocentric experiences of value. And we have at our disposal as human beings, we have a whole range of experiences of value that we could have access to, but too much of our culture restricts us. We're restricted to this anthropocentric lens where it's all about feeling good, right? The human animal feeling good. And so perhaps, rather than having a nice balanced wheel, describing our culture, we would have too much of an emphasis here. And this is all really large, a big, large section of our concerns is anthropocentric, and then we only make room for a little bit of non-anthropocentric concerns. And what Birch and the environment, and what environmental pragmatists and deep ecologists and ecofeminists, environmental virtue ethicists are all telling us is that we cannot continue to build our environmental ethics on the basis of these abstract dualisms. All right. So let me just kind of jump to the end of Birch's essay because I know I'm almost out of time here. My favorite section. Okay, right near the end on page 331, he writes about reasons for protecting ecological wholes. I realize he doesn't use that term ecological whole, but I really like that term. So. He talks about consequences for environmental ethics of his redescription of our subject matter, right? And all his talk about deontic experience, he concludes by saying there are 4 consequences that establishing universal consideration has for environmental ethics and for ethics in general. Okay, this is the upshot he wants to say. This is why we should pay attention to him, all right? He says, first, it helps us make sense, right? This thesis of universal consideration. Everything is morally considerable, okay? That thesis helps us make sense of